好，各位老师、各位参与的朋友，大家好，我是语言所修正好，同时也是我们台大双语教育中心的教师组组长。那今天非常开心哦，我们就是邀请到吴泓熹老师来我们分享。那今天午餐分享会呢，就是因为很可惜哦，因为疫情的关系，我们必须改成线上的方式来进行。不过呢，我们的诚意不减，热情不减啊！我们今天还是邀请到了吴老师啊，亲自来到我们水源校区的地方，我们从这边连线出去，跟各位老师一起参加今天的分享会。那我也稍微介绍一下吴老师的背景啊，吴老师目前服务于我们学校的农艺学系。那他过去呢，一直有在国外很多不同的单位待过。等一下吴老师会亲自介绍，不管是在英语系的国家、非英语系的国家，使用 EMI 的这些课程的一些国家，他都有非常丰富的经验。那他自己的一些研究领域，或者是他过去的教学经验，应该都非常适合在今天的分享会跟大家一起来做一些分享。那我不要再说太多，我把精彩的部分留给吴老师，我们一起欢迎吴老师。
Thanks for the Center of Bilingual Education to invite me to give this seminar for you guys. Differently as an owner, consider I'm a new faculty here. I think everybody online probably got more teaching experience than me at NTU. So it's differently, well, it's kind of strange to share my experience with you. So before we start, I would like to, hold on, technical difficulty as usual. Over the years, I've been to many different places. I actually did all my undergrad and PhD in New Zealand. That's at University of Auckland. After that, I spent a few years at the United States, teaching at various universities as a postdoc or guest lecturer or workshop. And the other interesting thing is, over the last 5 years, actually, I started joining industry before I moved back to academics. So you also have some exposure to like what happens when you teach in industry, what happens when you teach in a workshop setting instead of a university setting. So let's go to where I began, where I started. Then I'll give you some ideas of why I decided to teach EMI in this way. So I pretty much grew up in New Zealand. As you can see, that's a place with a lot of Maori influence and Maori cultures. Those are indigenous peoples. So their language do integrate into our society, such as, if you can see Peter Jackson there, we call white people called Pakeha as a Maori word. And Marae, that's like a temple for Maori peoples. And Aotearoa, actually the direct translation for Aotearoa is the land of a long white cloud. Actually just a very long way to say New Zealand. And lastly, the most famous one behind me actually is the haka, that's just a Maori war dance. So New Zealand is an English-speaking country. The Maori language actually integrate into our societies. And of course, it's a young country, so our English actually is full of slangs. And so a lot of, so if I make a comparison of a different word there, the one on your left-hand side, I think, is a New Zealand word. So whenever we say jandals, which means flip-flops. Chili beans, when I moved to America, people make fun of that. Say, what the hell is that? Well, it actually means they're just coolers. Togs means swimwears. And when you go to stationery sections, you will see vivid. That means permanent markers. And Twinks. That's a brand of correction fluid. And of course, the language is full of slang, so a lot of them just something you pick up as you go. For example, when you say ta, a nice and easy short word, that means thank yous. Sweet as, they got nothing to do with the food you are eating or the candy you are eating. It just means great or awesome. Dairy, that's a confusing one. New Zealand is full of agricultures. But actually, dairy, we are talking about any sort of corner store, convenience stores. So as you can see, it's an English-speaking country. However, a lot of words we use probably is not common in a lot of, it's not used in a lot of other countries. And I'm not particularly good at accents, so I can't really demonstrate this to you guys. Let's say one way to tell the difference between a Kiwi, a New Zealander, and Australian is ask them to say word fish and chips. A New Zealander, a Kiwi, will sound like a U sound. Australian will sound like an E sound. And that's one way you can tell them apart. And in New Zealand, beer and beer, the one on top. whether it's a big beer or you're drinking beer, they sound exactly the same. The only way you can tell them apart is context dependent. If you say the word in a spelling bee context, unfortunately, they sound exactly the same. And we also mentioned there's a lot of Maori influence, so I can't do a Maori accent, unfortunately. If you're interested in that, this way. Have a look at this movie, Sioni's Weddings. That's where they mock like Maori and New Zealand culture a lot. So essentially, where I grew up is we do use English in New Zealand, but the English we use is pretty different. And that really reflects to everything when I moved to United States for my postdocs. Besides things everybody know, where how we describe a car use completely different terminologies, the spelling is different. Some of those might be easier, such as O versus O and U. And some of them gets harder, like gray, whether it's spelled with E or A. I'm still pretty confused nowadays, so I never figured that apart. Culture-wise, the date format is completely different. Whether you put a date in front of it or months in front of it, they give you very different meanings. We also drive a different side of the road. I'm kind of surprised I didn't kill myself in the United States when I constantly moved to the wrong directions. Probably that's enough about me and my background. And as you can see, my English background is kind of different where I start with. So let me tell you a little bit about my teaching experience. Mainly I'm teaching English-speaking countries, it's like New Zealand, Australia, and United States. However, when I was in University of Auckland, I picked up the ethnic group between 2008 and 2010. That's when I was there. You notice, even as an English-speaking country, more than half of the population actually have different ethnic group. However, one thing I can't find is what is their first language. For example, Europeans. What proportion of them actually have English as a native language? How many of them are German, French, Swedish? Asians, how many of those are second generation Asians? They probably speak better English than a lot of Maori and Pacific Islanders. So in New Zealand, even as an English-speaking country, actually the culture is a mix. The language we use is a mix. We use a lot of different words and try to communicate with each other. In terms of for the last few years, when I briefly left academics during the industry, I was involved in a lot of industry after our trainings for my company, so that's software carpentry workshops. That's a workshop to teach biologists how to program. And pretty much let's speak a different language, from biology to a programming language. And over the year, I also get a chance to invite to a few international evolutionary workshops. Spent 1 week at Fudan and 2 weeks at Bali, Indonesia. And this is where things get interesting. I probably would say that's my real EMI experience before I moved back to NTUs. When everybody in the class, in the workshop, have different English levels and nobody have English as a first language. So this is probably my take for the EMI. Over the years, I do come to, am I blocking the last part? Yes. I do come to a lot of realizations how difficult it is for students. For me, personally, I moved to New Zealand when I was junior high school. Barely speak any English. Probably the best time of my life. I literally failed every single test for 2 years. And whenever there's a test, if it's multi-choice, you put down C for every question. You don't read the questions because there's no point. True or false is always true, because probability say you got more likely to have the answer is true, and you get more than 50% if you put down all truths and all false. So given that background, I kind of understand why a lot of students so far don't like to go to EMI class. They don't like to go to English class. It's definitely a high bar to get through. On the other hand, for a lot of professors, you say, hey, I've been teaching Mandarin for my entire life. Do I really want to teach in English? At the same time, I feel your pain as well. After I moved back, I got invited to a few guest lectures in Mandarins. Oh boy, that's hard. If you think I'm give a bad seminar here, wait until you see I give a lecture in Mandarins. Probably will be a pretty unfortunate experience for you. Everything is break up into pieces and extremely disconnected. And so that's kind of like my take on like my understanding of why people are against EMI a little bit. On the other hand, I also love EMI. Part of them is benefit for students, I believe. Most of the research is conducted in English. And also benefit me. It's definitely easier for me to teach in English. On the other hand, I also believe that benefit for students and both local and international students. A lot of international students actually have their English as their second or third language as well. I have students from Thai, Malaysia, or people with Spanish, Portuguese as their first language. And so it's not exactly easy for them to study in English either. So put all those things together, what is the EMI lecture I try to build here? This is what I call a wishful thinking. If EMI is mainly about content and knowledge, let's say that take up 90% of them, can we squeeze 20% English into that? It's sort of, to me, that makes sense. If you went through an EMI course, if your English didn't improve at all, then what is the point of an EMI class? So can we squeeze 20% into this, make it 110% lectures? It's definitely overthinking. It's definitely best case scenarios. And here's a few things I think that will help me try to achieve these goals. So let's start by breaking into three sections. Firstly is expectations. I actually get a lot from when I was in industries, set the right expectation for your employees, for your supervisors. Usually avoid a lot of conflicts afterwards. Next thing is barrier and communications. A lot of the time when we talk about barriers, I'm actually thinking about content barrier instead of language barriers. Language, let's fall into a communication part. Lastly, I think that's one thing that's really struggle for all of us is how do we get feedback from students? It's hard enough for students to talk to in a class in Mandarin. How can we get feedback for them in English? So firstly, the expectations. In the industries, when I run an after-hour workshop, first thing we notice them is this is after-hour workshop. You come here at your own time, we are not going to pay you. You come here because you want to learn. It's completely up to you. Pretty much that's the same as when you work with your employee, your direct report, or your supervisors. You set the expectation for them and say, what do you expect to achieve in this workshop? Or what do you expect to achieve in a month of work? Then you also take a content expectation. I'm kind of blocking this. I'm going to move out of the way for temporarily. When I was teaching statistics to biologists, a lot of students they actually hate math. Before that's why I take biologists. So I say, yes, this is a statistics course. If you hate math, unfortunately, we need to go through some of them. And of course, they get difficult when you got mature students to come to you and say, I haven't used math since high school. That's like 30 years ago. All right, we can work on that together. On international workshop, it's a 2 weeks intensive workshop every day, 9 to 5. Are you prepared for that? If you're not prepared for that, you probably will not sign up to this international workshop in English, which conduct the workshop location is in Indonesia, but we do everything in English. So essentially, we bring this to the EMI course. In the EMI course, first thing I basically tell them is this course will be in English. I didn't know this before. Now I realize you don't have to run everything in English for EMI course, but it's easier for me, so I still run it that way. But next thing I tell them is, hold on, we are going to do this in English, but it's no correct English. If I move out of the way so you can see a map a little bit. If you travel around the world, you will find there are so many different accent, dialogue, variation of terminology you use. It's really no point to say to students, you must speak English in exactly this way. You must speak like a Hollywood accent, where you see on the movie, all those things. And people in southern part of the United States, Deep South especially, I'm not quite sure I can point that, the Deep South, where Alabama, if you ask them to talk to people from Scotland, I think they might have a communication breakdown because they have extremely different accents. So this is one thing I said to a student at the beginning. This is an EMI course. We're going to do everything in English, but don't worry, it's no such thing as correct English. Another thing I will try to enlighten them is, why do we do this in English? This is a really useful language. It's a really useful tool. It's communication tools. Imagine you go to a conference at Europe, or you go to backpacking around Europe. You'll see everybody from different European countries. You probably have one common language, which is English. And at that stage, when your communication is, you are not trying to speak perfect, flawless, everything grammatically correct. You just try to communicate with each other. And that is the point I basically say, we can kind of ignore the test a little bit. Then the next thing is, I said, we are going to mark everything in English. You hand in your assignment in English, you do your seminar, group presentation in English, but we are not going to mark you on a lot of things. And those are kind of expectations for them, and so let's give them some, one, they know they sign up for a full English course. Two, English is not meant to be a barrier for them. English is a tool of communication. It's just a medium for them to learn the content they need. So lastly, I tell them my English hero. If you want to learn English, learn from this guy. He's 900 years old. He knows what is going on. And that's how good his English is. And so we'll move to a second part. Once we set out this common ground with your students in a class, we definitely still have English barriers. So we are not trying to ignore that. Definitely there's some sort of minimum English requirements. I think everybody has different recommendations. But to me, a lot of time the requirement probably come from communications. The barrier comes from communications. My background is in bioinformatics, so it's an interdisciplinary research. A lot of time you work with biologists, statisticians, and computer scientists. Even all of them speak English in English-speaking countries. We use very different language, use very different terminologies. So to summarize my experience in teaching and versus the outcome of teachings, differently, if you try to teach a workshop or like a after-hour workshop in a business or a sign-up workshop, English is never a problem. And where English is struggling is when you have an international workshop where sometimes you are communicating not in sentence, you communicate in short phrase. Or some people you start communicating in individual word or vocab. By this you can get communication through. And usually what I find is when you start to have those people, motivation actually trumps language barriers. If they really, really want to learn, we can work together to overcome that. Sure, definitely that's a trade-off. The trade-off is time. The communication does take longer, but it's not impossible. So this is what I say probably like the most common communication barriers is interdisciplinary research. When everybody speaks language, but use different terminologies, you use different vocab. When you say the word stage, what does that mean? For medical people, that means different stage of cancer. For artist people, this is why you're performing on stage. For statistician, you might build a model, or computer scientist, you might build a model, have different stages. So a lot of time the communication area breakdown is not come from, it's not because you use English, it's you didn't define or you didn't agree on the terminology you are going to use together. So that's why I say I think there's two types of barriers when we teach an EMI course. One is a content barriers, one is language barriers. Differently, how am I going to point to this? You'll see we'll put like a big section up there. That's a fence, the English different is a barrier for students when they try to learn this course. But a lot of time, I think the English barrier is not because they don't know English, they don't have good English. This is NTU after all. The barrier comes from do they have their prerequisite? Do they know the prerequisite course in English? Do they know the terminologies? Can they think those fast enough? So this is something I tend to build for them. I'm still working on this. First one is, if they have content barriers, they didn't satisfy the prerequisite course. You can't teach someone advanced organic chemistry when they don't know basic chemistry. They will struggle in any language. It doesn't matter. The next thing is, this I think is definitely a big issue for EMI course. When you have advanced course in English, or you teach anything in English, do they have their background? Can I translate all their background into English? Do they have the terminologies? When you say something in statistics, something as simple as variance, means, if they never learn those words in English, even those are something you should assume, This is something we can assume in an English-speaking country. They learn those in previous class already. How can we help them to translate those language, those terminology to English? Then if they overcome those two barriers, the next things we need to think about is the communications. How can we lower the English barrier for them? How can we make life easier if they don't understand every word you said? What else can we do? What are the communication channels we can use? Lastly, I think is the most important one. How can we give students enough motivation to, one, learn the content you want, two, learn the English at the same time? If they have enough motivation, I think they can overcome any other challenge they have. So one thing I do find very different is when you teach in English-speaking country and EMI is the terminologies. A lot of students, when they see a big word, a new word that in this class they never see it before, they immediately rush to Google Translate. They say, what does that word mean? And let's step back a little bit. If I teach a new terminology in English-speaking country, I need to define for them anyway. Because one of those things nobody knows. That's why you come to a class. A lot of time when students rush into Google Translate, usually the meaning is not very useful. A lot of those words, those terminology are context dependent. So I think this is different one of the barrier we need to work with students. And lastly, communication breakdowns. This is guaranteed to happen regardless what language you are using and regardless who you talk to. Even everybody speak perfect English or perfect Mandarin, you will get different communication barrier, miscommunication as well. So this is when we think about like there are multiple different ways to communicate with each other. So normally we say there are 4 different ways to teach or learn. One is by reading and writing. One is by visually looking at things, where they want to do a timeline or flowchart. Lastly is audios. A lot of time we focus on EMI is on audio things. Different with the technology nowadays, it's pretty easy to integrate all those 4 different methods together. And kinesthetic, it gets harder. It depends on different lectures. Like for biology, you can do actual wet lab. It's more doable. For certain courses, they will be harder. So there's one thing I think technology helps us a lot. It's called YouTube. If we record the lectures, upload to YouTube, actually is doing a pretty good job to give you the auto captions. So if students have certain barrier in language, English, they can't hear things properly, they can go to YouTube and turn on auto caption. If they both read at the same time and listen at the same time, they tend to make life easier for them. Now, students where they really struggle in the content you speak, YouTube also got something called auto translate. They kind of work, the English auto caption work like 70–80% of the time. The auto translation probably 60–70%. But that's better than nothing. So a lot of time we can think about this way is when you communicate with students, it's not only things you speak, it's a lot of other resources and media you can use them together to do these communications. And the other fun thing from YouTube is this is something actually I learned from the previous EMI workshop. Is this thing called vocab profiler. As you notice, this is one of the lectures conducted on database. You will find 90% of the word we use in a lecture is elementary word. Of course, you will say put a lot of simple words together, whether the content makes sense or not. That's a different question. But let's fall into what the things I talked about previously. That's a vocab. That's what you come here for. Those are the things you should not use Google Translate to find out the meaning in different language, because the context, that's what the language makes sense. That's what makes those special vocab make sense. So a lot of times students, I think we need to give students more confidence. They actually have pretty much all the English they need. The vocab usually is not difficult for a class. 90% of the vocab we use is in the first 2,000 words. They should easily cover that in the junior high school, high school. And even I start looking at some of the red categories. They got words something like videos. Our kind of surprise video is such a hard word in this vocab test. So a lot of time I think this is something fun for people to play around with, and we also need to give students some confidence that they actually have all the skills that they have already to take an English EMI course. And the next thing I did is, this is a feature you have on NTU Cool. If students have enough motivations, well, this probably only works for students with enough motivations, is I create a question bank, have 20 questions. Every time they take this quiz, they randomly draw 10 of it. We solve by hostage them with 1% of the class. I do give them unlimited attempts. If they have enough motivation, some students did go through this quiz 10 times. They are not satisfied with 9.5. They want 10 out of 10. And so after that, a lot of things is one thing we try to teach them is you are not going to learn everything from us. A lot of time is we teach you how to learn things by yourself. And I think a question bank is something we use a lot in University of Auckland to say you have almost unlimited number of questions for you to practice and try if you have enough motivation to go through them. Now, let's go through something I learned in the industry and workshop. That's one thing when we teach programming for non-programmers, one thing we do is called live coding. The reason we do live coding is one, they force you to go slower. You have to type it. And the second thing is you meant to make a mistake. You want to show students you can make mistakes. And one, they give them time to catch up. Two is realistic scenarios. And students will go into this misunderstanding if you just copy paste and show them a lecture slide. Say, oh, everything is perfect. Of course, that's not in real life. So this is so I mitigate the barrier of English. You show them, you do a demonstration for them live so they understand how things work. The next thing is feedback. How do you get feedback from students? It's always hard. Especially in English class, you actually want constant feedback. A lot of time, the second half of the lecture is built on something you started on the first half. How do you know that they understand the first half? That's something, a little subtle trick we use as an instant feedback. We give students sticker note. You post a sticker note and say, do you understand this? I put a green one, blue one up. That means, yes, you're good. Red one, no, please explain again. We are completely lost. We find that works really well because if you ask students, do you have questions? Who doesn't understand that? Most students don't want to put their hand up and say, I'm completely lost. Can you explain it again? Most people don't want to do that. And you give them a tiny sticker note and say, OK, I can do this subtly. They give them some confidence and they can express their feedback instantly. What happens if you really want the student to speak? May the odds be in your favor. Press spin the bottle, spin the wheels, and I do not force them to speak. But what I find is most students are pretty willing to participate when their name come out on the wheels. I don't know whether they hate me or not, so I don't do this at every lecture. But usually that works pretty well. And that thing is, with the technology nowadays, there's a lot of online tools, online softwares, like the WebEx we use today. They actually have a pooling systems here. And so if you never try this, feel free to scan this QR code and have a look. It's just a simple, you can do a multi-choice, you can do a word of choice. Then you can have some sort of summary result to display to a student, to do a feedback. So a lot of those technology nowadays that can help us to mitigate a lot of the English barrier or communication barriers to prevent miscommunication by communicating with them with multiple channels and get instant feedbacks. One thing I think we struggle a lot with EMI course is exactly this diagram shows here. If you Google this, you will get the correct answer is 42. And in the class, nobody will get that. This is where pop culture come in. Pop culture come in, I think this is a really big challenge when you teach an EMI class. If I try to explain to something, say hey, I'm a double agent, in the English-speaking country, I might quote the movie Departed. Student might not know what is that movie. Sure, I can quote the English version for that. It's called Internal Affair. Departed is based on this movie. I was like, what is that movie again? Actually, it's Hong Kong movies. This is where people probably understand that a lot. So this is some sort of pop cultural barriers. I think that become really difficult when you teach an EMI class. Of course, students nowadays, they probably know Spy Family more than any other movies. This might be fall into a category of generation gap. That's something we all can work on. So lastly, in the workshop, a lot of those things I learned that from the wrong side. The software carpentry workshop is we do want feedback from students. And once again, they are not going to verbally tell you the feedback at the end of the class. So we do something like this. Feel free to scan this QR code. It's something we call one up, one down. At the end of the class, they are very good with this keyboard. They have no problem typing things. They just don't want to speak it. They say one up, one down. Tell me one thing you find useful, one thing you learn in this class. One thing you don't like, you think is useless, something you don't understand. If you get those feedback, and if a lot of people give one down, say I don't understand certain section in a class, and next lecture you can adapt there, say, can I explain in a different way? Still with English, maybe use different terminology, different content, different way to communication, different figures, different flow chart, and so on. And lastly, where am I? If you ask any questions in the class, it's guaranteed you are not going to get anything. So typically in a workshop, the things we ask is, what question do you have? Now it's time for questions. Please ask questions and let's open up the floor for question and communications.
谢谢，我自己学到很多。我觉得今天这个我学到很多，特别是就是说对学生的这个 mindset 的预备，就是说他们进入到这堂课堂上，说你到底适不适合这堂课，或者你要做什么样的准备，我觉得这应该是非常非常有用的 mindset。然后我自己学到很多小技巧，比如说刚刚说那个 post-it 那个东西啊，我觉得学生应该会觉得很好玩才对。对啊，就是我自己没有。我刚刚在下面听的时候，我就觉得，我怎么好像都没有问学生你会不会，我就一直自己讲，一直讲，一直讲，一直讲，然后特别是最后一站我很有感觉，我都说有没有问题，然后通常都是没有问题，绝对不会有问题的，就是有没有问题，然后就很安静的这样，然后我就必须自己匆匆的准备下台这样，这个是的确是很多很多经验。那今天呢，我们虽然是线上的方式，我们还是欢迎线上的老师，不管你是要举手发问。或者是要在旁边的聊天室，你要留言发问，比如说，也许你正在吃午饭啊，不方便开镜头，那你要打字也很 OK。我们的专员会在聊天室里面帮我们转述这些问题。那我们在等待的时候，我自己先问一下，就是吴老师啊，就是说你在过去这么多不一样地方的场域，好，就是说它可能是英语使用的国家，或非英语母语使用的国家。那特别是在这些非英语母语使用的国家里面 ，EMI 的操作。跟在台湾或者特别是在台大有什么不一样呢？你自己的经验是怎么样？
可以用英文回答吗？对，这个就是 one thing. So as I mentioned earlier, I actually don't have a lot of experience in EMI in NTU yet. But one thing I think the biggest difference is one, a lot of the students in Taiwan we think they are shy. They don't want to ask questions. They have limited interaction with students. So this is when I'll try to use a lot of different media or different way to communicate. The other one is how much does the student want to learn motivations. In an international workshop, it's a voluntary workshop. It's think about 2 weeks, 9 to 5 workshop. You have to be dedicated enough to block your time, your life to come to that workshop. And students very, very engaged in that scenarios. And as I mentioned earlier, when students engage enough, you sort of start to feel English barrier is no longer exists. A lot of people did mention one issues, I guess, in the education system here is students are too focused on, I must speak correct English. Every sentence, they don't want to just put their hand up and just like throw out random words. They want to formulate their sentence to be everything perfectly correct. They can get A in that sentence before they want to ask that. So a lot of time, the different communication channel, different communication, different method to lower the communication barrier. The trade-off actually is time. And so unfortunately, for EMI class, you might have to reduce your content a little bit just because you need allocate extra time for this kind of communications.
我自己的经验的确也是这样，就是我这个学期也在，很不好意思啊，我这个学期也在教这个 EMI 的课程。但是我常常就是课程通通都讲不完，真的都讲不完，然后我对学生就很抱歉，我就觉得说我下次要改进，下次要改进。所以的确就是吴老师讲到一个很重要的，就是说我们的确在 EMI 课堂上好像真的会预计的时间跟实际上执行的时间会有一定的落差。那我也相信是说， 如果我们给授课同学有先设定好这样的一个心理预备 ，what to expect in an EMI classroom， 跟 what to not expect in an EMI classroom， 我想彼此都会有比较好的一个期待，那这个整个outcome 应该会比较清楚一些。那吴老师接下来的来年的规划还是会在 EMI 课上面，就是有什么样的规划吗？就是在新的年度上面。
对，基本上接下来我目前是开了2堂 EMI 的课，明年应该要开个第3堂，那可能就继续以英文教英文为主。那其实有点实际的就是说对我来讲用英文教真的比较容易啊。是。我可能也没有，我跟学生讲说，这堂课我真的没有办法用中文教你啊。OK。所以这个也是学生一个 expectation。当然这个就是你说早晚可能要练习，就是自己给自己一个借口啊，就说我现在用英文教书，我就可以不用用中文教这样子但是 EMI 这个东西应该就是我相信学校不管是各个方面可能会越来越多这种课程。当然我们只有学校说 EMI 其实不需要是全部英文的，是可以是不知道60-70分、70-80%是一个 hybrid 的 mode。那这些我想是学生的接受度应该会越来越高。我想一开始学生可能是想说全英语课程，当然是有点不管是有点心里有点恐惧，或有点scare 之类的但是我想接下来几年当这个变成一个 norm 的时候，学生接受度也会越来越高。是，我想接下来几年应该会越来越常态啦。那就是说现阶段我们在校的在学的一些学生，跟未来3年后、5年后我们遇到的学生族群可能是不太一样的。那现在中学端如果都已经在推动所谓的 CLIO 或者是双语教育的话，等到他们3年后、5年后进到大学端的时候，那时候我们再来准备，我们自己身为教师再来准备，会有点来不及。倒不如我们就现在 might as well 先开始，这是一个很好的练习的一个场域，或是练习的机会，对我来说都是一个很好的学习这样子。那我想在最后请教一下吴老师，我很多问题问你，不好意思，就是说你说你的经验不多，但是我觉得你其实经验应该是非常丰富的。那您就过去开的这2门 EMI 课程，目前为止收到的，不管是期中评鉴或者是期末的一些回馈，有没有什么比较特别？你觉得可以提出来跟老师们分享？就是说，学生们特别提出了这一点，那为什么他们特别讲说我哪里做的很好？他们觉得学习到很多，是不是可以提供给老师们做一个借鉴呢？ 上学期我是开 Introduction to Bioinformatics， 这学期是开 Statistics 那 Statistics 这堂课因为是必修课，所以其实我们同时有中文跟英文的班级，所以其实我们班上都是他们的 native language 都不是 Mandarin。所以当然就是大家就是没有选择，就是基本上就是全部用英文沟通。那其实我做一下那堂课，我做一下 survey， 因为学期还没结束嘛，好做一下 survey， 好像只有1个人他的 native English 是 English， 好，所以其实我们大家都是用一个 secondary language 在 communicate。Bioinformatics 那堂课其实这个就很有趣了，这个就是大家会常常发现说，如果学生的我们说平常学生是 normally distributed， 当然英文程度会非常的不一样。有学生上完课之后很喜欢，决定加入我实验室，那我们所有的 meeting 其实全部都用英文进行的。也有学生在 feedback 里头说，我上课英文实在讲太快。对，这点我承认。有时候上课讲话，你讲的开心的，就是我在外国讲多快，在台湾就讲多快。在纽西兰可能讲快又比美国还要快。有些学生说讲太快了，有些学生说，我们为什么不可以把有些 material 翻成中文？甚至有变成说中文的 TA 来帮助学生understand 这一些东西。所以其实我觉得那些是很好的 feedback， 这些可能就是说第一次开这堂课，一开始开比较你没有那么 prepare， 这些东西我觉得是 over the year， 你可以不用慢慢加上去说，你有English content 的 materials， 你有什么东西，比如说像我们当初我刚才讲 YouTube translation。你如果英文的 YouTube audio video 看不懂，用 auto translation function 可不可以帮助你更容易理解这个 content？ 因为毕竟 EMI 到最后重要是 content driven， 我们不是 this is not English course we are not teaching English， we are teaching content expert materials。所以主要就是我们要想办法让lower English 这个 barrier。那当然学生的 feedback学生的 feedback 跟我想象中其实有点类似，就是有蛮两极化的。有些觉得英文上课非常好，有些英文上课就是对他们负担还是蛮大的。 这个应该就是我们可以用各式方法、各种不同的方法，让他们make the English EMI class easier for them 这样子。
是的，谢谢吴老师。谢谢。那我们最后还有没有？如果老师线上有问题的话，欢迎举手发问。那同时呢，我们现在在聊天室我们专员们抛了一个这次分享会的问卷调查，也麻烦老师们给我们一些回馈，那作为我们接下来一些活动的一些参考跟改进。那最后时间我们就会是可能要谢谢吴老师今天跟我们分享，这是我们这个期最后一次午餐分享会的一个活动。那我们就非常谢谢吴老师，谢谢老师，谢谢。那我们也对，不好意思，我们还要给吴老师一个感谢的一个奖状，谢谢老师来参与，谢谢老师。好，谢谢吴老师，谢谢。那我们下学期会有更多的双语教育中心的一些活动，那希望老师能够可以多多参加，多多支持。那以及我们接下来会有这些影片都会上传到我们中心的网页，希望老师也可以多多上网来观看。奖励办法是，专业们提醒我，就是我们马上在下个学期马上就会开始推出，在学校里面，如果老师你是英语授课 EMI 课程的话，我们会有将你的课程录制成影片的一个补助办法。那欢迎老师来申请这个课程的一个转录成数位影片的课程的补助办法。那我们会有2到3个不一样的方式，一个就是说直录的课程是我们会派摄影团队到老师的课堂上，直接把课堂的互动录制下来。第二个就是老师呢，你到摄影棚，专业的摄影棚，我们数期中心的摄影棚，然后把整个学期的课程录制下来，数位会的影片。那这我相信应该是对于未来这种如果是混成教学是常态或者是必须要进行的这种模式的话，我相信应该是非常好的一个方式。那第3种就是有一些比较经典的课程或是迷你课程，我们有一个专录的方式。如果老师你对于某一个课程一个系列课程未必是16周，未必是18周的课程，但是它是一个精华，也许6周、8周的这种课程的话，我们也非常欢迎老师来申请。那也非常希望老师呢可以密切注意相关的一些讯息以及接下来的公告。那也希望老师可以多多参与我们双语教育中心举办的其他活动。那今天我们的活动就到这边，我就谢谢大家，也再次谢谢吴老师，谢谢大家，拜拜。